By now, we all know that Isabelle's got her fair share of fancy sweaters, but there's been one sweater in particular that has always caught my eye. I'm Erin from Nubby Notes, and today we'll be making a keychain inspired by Animal Crossing New Horizons. Let's get into it. To start, I used some Sculpey oven-baked clay. I took some of the clay and a glass jar and rolled it out to be as flat as possible. Next, I took another ball of clay and rolled it into a thin snake. Once the clay was at a thickness that I had liked, I took a knife and cut the snake into smaller strips. I followed this really awesome tutorial to get the clay to look knitted. Essentially, I piled 2 of the clay strands next to each other before taking and twisting 2 more strands. A link for this tutorial will be in the description box below. Then I just continued this pattern until I ran out of space. I kind of stink at using clay, but the tutorial was very straightforward and I really liked the way that it turned out in the end. Then I used this cap to cut the clay like a cookie cutter. And when it didn't cut all the way through, I ended up using my clay blade instead. After the piece was cut out, I used my clay tool and my fingers to smooth out the edges. Once that was finished, I took an eye pin and pushed it into the top of the piece. Now, you're just gonna have to trust me for this next part, but for Isabelle's head, I took this ball of clay and flattened it. Then I used my fingers to make 4 rounded edges. I used my clay tool to help define each edge. And after a bit of sculpting, Isabelle's head was finished. Just like the bigger clay piece, I took an eye pin and pushed it into the top of Isabelle's head. With that, both pieces were ready to bake. Once baked, I used my pliers to take out each eye pin. Off camera, I sanded each piece, and here's how they looked. For the color, I used this watered down acrylic paint. As I painted, I made sure to get into all the nooks and crannies. I ended up adding this lighter brown to help the color to be a bit more like Isabelle's sweater. After a bunch more layers and some drying, here's how the color turned out. Now for Isabelle's head, I used this arsenal of paints and pens. Since clay really isn't my forte, I relied on my painting skills to help bring Isabelle to life. Isabelle's base is mostly made of yellows, so I started with a lighter shade of yellow and then gradually got darker. My fine tip brush was a real lifesaver for all of these details. After the yellows, I used some white for the area around Isabelle's mouth. Then I carefully took my Sharpie and gel pens to add on Isabelle's face details. Next, I used a red Sharpie to add the ribbon in Isabelle's hair. And then for the final details, I went back to my trusty brush. And here she is. To seal in the paint job, I finished it with this matte spray. I was really pleased with how they turned out. It was really smooth, but not too shiny. Next, I took the eye pins from earlier and fixed them back in place with a bit of Gorilla Glue. For the flower patch on Isabelle's sweater, I sketched up and cut out a template. And for the patch itself, I used some scrap felt pieces. With each felt sheet, I traced and cut out all the parts of the template. One of the reasons why I use felt for this project is because I'm not too confident in my clay abilities, but I also really like mixing different materials when I can. I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling this way, but Animal Crossing has really taken over my life ever since the update and the new DLC. My head is chock full of all kinds of Animal Crossing ideas, so if you enjoy this video and would like to see more Animal Crossing videos, leave a comment or boop the like button to let me know. After cutting out each felt piece, I wanted to define the flower petals a bit more. So I took my thread and needle and wrapped it around each petal to define the flower. And here's how they look. It's a really subtle detail, but I like the way they turned out. Next, I got to glue all the felt pieces together. Off camera, I cleaned up the edges, and then it was time to glue the patch onto the charm. And to finish off the keychain, I used 3 jump rings, a lobster clasp, and my pliers to attach all of the pieces to the keychain. As always, if you decide to make this craft, feel free to tag me at NubbyNotes on Instagram and Twitter. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.